I stared at my phone screen, unable to process what I was seeing. My breath caught in my throat as I read the caption again. Here's to my absent grandmother, who only shows up when she wants something. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. There was a photo of me from last Christmas, awkwardly standing by the tree, holding a small wrapped gift. Abigail had posted it on Instagram just hours ago. On my birthday. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the comments. Some people just don't deserve to be called family, wrote one of Abigail's friends. You're better off without toxic relatives, added another. I set my phone down on the kitchen table and pressed my hands against my eyes, trying to stop the tears that threatened to spill over. 66 years old today. And this is what I'd received instead of a call or a card. Absent grandmother. Only shows up when she wants something. The words cut deeper than any knife could have. If only she knew. If only any of them knew. I'd worked 2 jobs for 15 years after Harold died to make sure Rebecca had everything she needed. Missed school plays and parent-teacher conferences because I was covering extra shifts at the hospital. Developed arthritis in my hands from years of typing medical records at night while Rebecca slept. And now my granddaughter, who'd been systematically kept from me for most of her life, believed I was some kind of opportunistic stranger who drifted in and out of her life at my convenience. The unfairness of it burned in my chest like acid. I glanced at the small cupcake I'd bought myself, a single candle sticking out of its center unlit. What a pitiful birthday celebration. Alone in my small apartment, with nothing but hurtful words from the only family I had left. Rebecca had married Thomas when Abigail was just 2. Thomas, with his old money and influential family, had never approved of me, a worn-out nurse with calloused hands and a small house in the wrong part of town. His parents quickly assumed the role of the proper grandparents, and Rebecca, always eager to climb the social ladder, had been all too happy to let them. Gradually, my invitations to birthdays and holidays became fewer and further between. When I did attend, I was seated at the far end of the table, away from the immediate family. My gifts were received with stiff smiles and quickly set aside. We're just very busy, Mom, Rebecca would say when I called, her voice always slightly annoyed, as if I were interrupting something important. Maybe next month. Next month would become next season, then next year. And now this. A public humiliation from a granddaughter who'd been taught to see me as nothing more than an inconvenience. I walked to the small bookshelf in my living room and pulled out an old photo album. Inside were pictures of Rebecca as a baby, as a child, as a teenager. Pictures of me holding her, reading to her, standing proudly at her high school graduation. Pictures that told a very different story than the one Abigail believed. I traced my finger over a photo of Rebecca at 5, sitting on my lap as I read her a bedtime story after working a 12-hour shift. My eyes were tired, but my smile was genuine. That's when the idea came to me. If words couldn't reach them, maybe evidence could. I would create an album, not just of photos but of documents, letters, receipts, everything that would prove to Abigail who I really was. Everything that would show her the truth about her absent grandmother. I stood up, wiping away my tears. For too long, I'd allowed Rebecca and Thomas to control the narrative. For too long, I'd silently accepted being pushed aside, afraid that fighting back would cost me what little access I had to my granddaughter. But Abigail was 22 now, old enough to judge for herself, old enough to know the truth. I picked up my phone and looked again at the hurtful post. This time, instead of pain, I felt resolve hardening in my chest. Happy birthday to me, I whispered, blowing out the unlit candle. Tomorrow, I would begin gathering the evidence of my life. And soon, very soon, Abigail would learn exactly who her grandmother really was. The next morning, I pulled the storage boxes from under my bed. I hadn't opened them in years, too many memories, too much pain. But now, these cardboard containers held the ammunition I needed. I started with the oldest box labeled Rebecca, Early Years. Inside were stacks of photographs, report cards, and children's drawings. I selected a photo of me in my nurse's uniform, holding newborn Rebecca in the hospital. My eyes were ringed with exhaustion after a 20-hour labor, but my face glowed with love. Harold had taken that picture just hours before he left for his night shift at the factory. 3 years later, he would be dead, crushed under machinery that malfunctioned. Next, I found the payment stubs from the hospital and the medical transcription company where I'd worked nights. Hundreds of them spanning years. Each one represented nights away from Rebecca. Missed bedtimes and morning breakfasts. Each one a brick in the foundation I was building for her future. "You were always at work," Rebecca had accused me once, during her rebellious teenage years. "You cared more about your patients than you did about me." She never understood that it was because I cared about her that I worked so hard. That her ballet lessons, her braces, her college education, all of it came from those endless shifts. I pulled out a small notebook, its cover worn from years of use. Inside, in my careful handwriting, was a record of every school event I'd tried to attend. Parent-teacher conferences, dance recitals, soccer games. Next to each entry were notes. Arrived 15 minutes late due to emergency at hospital, or missed completely, had to cover for Sarah. And then more painfully, the later entries. Rebecca said not to come, or invitation withdrawn. I set aside report cards with handwritten notes from teachers. Rebecca is thriving but seems to crave attention. Little did they know that I read those notes with a heart breaking from guilt, adding extra shifts to my already impossible schedule, just to afford the child psychologist Rebecca needed. As I sorted through the mementos, a pattern emerged. A timeline of my gradual erasure from Rebecca's life. It started subtly after she met Thomas in college. He came from old money, with parents who had never worked a day in their lives. They lived in a mansion in the best part of the city, summered in Europe, and sent their children to private schools. I found the invitation to their wedding cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing. So different from the simple courthouse ceremony Harold and I had shared. I remembered how out of place I felt that day, in my department store dress among designer gowns. How Thomas's mother had looked me up and down and whispered something to her husband that made him chuckle. Then came the photos from the early days of Abigail's life. Me holding her as a newborn, my face alight with the joy of being a grandmother. There were fewer pictures after that, just occasional snapshots at major holidays with increasing distance between me and the rest of the family. My fingers brushed against a small envelope. Inside was a check I'd written to contribute to Abigail's college fund on her 5th birthday. It had been returned uncashed with a note from Thomas. "We've got it covered. No need to strain yourself." As if my contribution was somehow tainted by my working-class background. As if they were doing me a favor by rejecting it. Then there were the birthday cards I'd sent to Abigail over the years. Some returned unopened. Others with no acknowledgement. I'd kept sending them anyway, hoping that someday she would know that her grandmother had never forgotten her. I found the hospital bills from my knee replacement surgery 3 years ago. I'd called Rebecca afterward, hoping for a ride home or some help during recovery. "We're just swamped right now, Mom," she'd said. "Between Abigail's college applications and Thomas's promotion party, we barely have a minute to breathe." I'd taken a taxi home and managed on my own, as I always had. The final item I pulled from the boxes was a small velvet jewelry box. Inside was my mother's pearl necklace, the only thing of value she'd owned. I'd planned to give it to Abigail on her 18th birthday, but the carefully orchestrated family dinner I was invited to had been so cold, so formal, that the moment never felt right. I'd kept the pearls, waiting for a time when Abigail might actually want something from her absent grandmother. I placed everything on my dining room table and surveyed the scattered evidence of my life. Decades of love, sacrifice, and gradual rejection, all laid bare in photographs and paper. "This is who I am," I whispered to the empty room. "This is who I've always been." I reached for an empty photo album I'd bought at the craft store that morning. Black with gold embossed words on the cover. The truth behind the pictures. Page by page, I began to assemble my defense. Not just a collection of memories but a testimony. A reckoning long overdue. It took me 3 days to complete the album. 3 days of tears, anger, and painful memories. But as I placed the final items, a series of unanswered text messages asking to see Abigail, I felt a strange sense of peace. The truth was laid bare, undeniable in its authenticity. Now came the hard part. Making sure Abigail actually saw it. I knew from Rebecca's occasional slips that they were having a family barbecue this weekend at their suburban mansion. Thomas's parents would be there, along with Thomas's sister and her husband. The perfect family portrait, minus the inconvenient grandmother. I sat on my couch, phone in hand, debating whether to call first. Last time I'd shown up unannounced, Thomas had blocked me at the door, claiming they were in the middle of something important. I'd glimpsed Abigail in the background, quickly ushered away by Rebecca as if I carried some contagious disease. "No more hiding," I muttered, slipping the phone back into my pocket. This time I would simply arrive. What could they do? Turn away a 66-year-old woman in front of their country club friends? The morning of the barbecue, I dressed carefully. Not the faded floral dress that Rebecca always seemed embarrassed by, but a simple navy blue sheath I'd bought for a colleague's retirement party. I styled my silver hair, applied light makeup, and put on the small diamond earrings Harold had given me for our 5th anniversary. I wanted to look dignified, respectable, not like the shabby, working-class embarrassment Thomas's family had always treated me as. The album sat on the passenger seat of my old Honda, as I drove to the affluent neighborhood where Rebecca and Thomas lived. Each passing mile heightened my anxiety, but also my determination. Today, someone would finally hear my side of the story. I pulled up to the imposing brick home with its manicured lawn and circular driveway already filled with luxury cars. A valet approached, a valet for a family barbecue, and I waved him away, parking on the street instead. Clutching the album to my chest like a shield, I walked up the stone path to the backyard gate. I could hear laughter, the clink of glasses, the hiss of meat on a grill. The sounds of family togetherness that I'd been systematically excluded from. Through the wrought iron bars, I spotted Thomas at the grill, wearing an apron that read "Grill Master" in bold letters. Rebecca flitted between guests, champagne flute in hand, the perfect hostess. Thomas's parents sat in places of honor under a large umbrella, holding court like visiting royalty. And there was Abigail, my beautiful granddaughter, laughing with a group of young people her age. Her long blonde hair, so like Rebecca's at that age, caught the sunlight. She wore a sundress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I took a deep breath and pushed open the gate. The conversations nearest me faltered first, then a ripple of awkward silence spread across the yard. Rebecca froze mid-sentence, her smile vanishing. Thomas looked up from the grill, his expression darkening. "Janet," he said loudly, setting down his tongs and moving toward me with forced casualness. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you." Of course they weren't. They never did. "I won't stay long," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I just wanted to give Abigail something." I could feel every eye on me as Thomas reached me, positioning himself like a bouncer blocking an unwanted club patron. "Now isn't really a good time," he said quietly, his smile tight. "We have guests." "It'll only take a minute," I insisted, looking past him to where Abigail stood, watching the interaction with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Rebecca appeared at Thomas's side, her face flushed with either embarrassment or anger, probably both. "Mom," she hissed, "you should have called first. Would you have answered?" I asked, meeting her gaze directly. She flinched, confirming what we both knew. She wouldn't have. "What's going on?" It was Abigail, approaching cautiously, as if I were some unpredictable wild animal that had wandered into their perfect garden party. Up close I could see Thomas's features in her face, the straight nose, the determined chin. But her eyes were Rebecca's. My eyes. "Hello, Abigail," I said, struggling to keep my voice from cracking. "I brought you something." I held out the album, its black cover gleaming in the sunlight. Thomas moved to intercept it. "Let me take that." "No." My voice was sharper than I intended. "It's for Abigail. Only Abigail." Thomas's mother rose from her seat, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet yard. "Thomas, is everything all right?" "Fine, Mother," he called back, but his clenched jaw said otherwise. Abigail looked from her father to me, then back again. Something in her expression shifted, a flicker of defiance. "It's okay, Dad," she said, reaching for the album. "I'll take it." Our fingers brushed as she took the heavy book from my hands. For a moment, just a moment, we were connected, grandmother to granddaughter, a bridge across the chasm that had been deliberately placed between us. "There's a letter inside," I said softly. "Please read it before you look at anything else." Abigail nodded, a small frown creasing her forehead. Rebecca stepped closer, her voice tight. "Mom, you've given your gift. Now isn't the time for—" "I know," I interrupted. "I'm leaving. I just wanted to make sure she got it." I turned to go, feeling their collective relief at my departure. But at the gate, I paused and looked back at my granddaughter, still holding the album with a confused expression. "Happy belated birthday to me, by the way," I said. Then I walked out, feeling Thomas's family's stares burning into my back, but also feeling something else. The lightness of finally fighting back. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I'd thrown a grenade into the carefully constructed narrative of the Montgomery Preston family and walked away. Now all I could do was wait for the fallout. Would Abigail even open the album? Or would Thomas and Rebecca convince her to throw it away unopened, dismissing it as the desperate attention-seeking of a bitter old woman? I made myself tea and watched the sunrise from my small balcony, wondering what was happening across town in that brick mansion. My phone remained silent. No angry calls from Rebecca, no messages from Thomas threatening to cut off what little contact I still had with their family. The silence was somehow worse than the confrontation I'd expected. Around noon my doorbell rang. I froze, teacup halfway to my lips. No one ever visited me unexpectedly. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the door and peered through the peephole. Abigail stood in the hallway, my album clutched in her arms, her eyes red-rimmed. My hand shook as I unlocked the door. We stared at each other in silence, 3 generations of pain and misunderstanding stretching between us. "May I come in?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse as if she'd been crying or yelling for hours. I stepped aside, gesturing her in. My apartment suddenly seemed shabby through her eyes. The worn furniture, the faded curtains, the small kitchen with its outdated appliances. So different from the luxury she'd grown up in. Abigail walked to my living room and sat down on the edge of the couch, placing the album carefully on the coffee table. "I read everything," she said. "I stayed up all night." I nodded, perching on the armchair across from her, afraid to hope. "Is it true?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "All of it. Every page," I confirmed. "I have the originals of all those documents if you want to see them." She shook her head, her gaze dropping to the album. "The letter you wrote. About working 2 jobs after Grandpa died. About putting Mom through college. About trying to visit me when I was little. Yes. Mom said you were always too busy for family. That you chose work over her. That's why you were never around when I was growing up." The familiar pain flared in my chest. "I worked because I had to, Abigail. After your grandfather died, there was no one else to provide for your mother. No family money, no inheritance. Just me and my nursing salary. And when Mom married Dad?" I smiled sadly. "Your father made it very clear that I didn't fit into the life they were building. His parents were the kind of grandparents he wanted for you, well-connected, wealthy, part of the right social circles. I was just the embarrassing working-class mother, who never knew which fork to use at dinner." Abigail winced. "Those checks you sent for my birthday and Christmas. The ones that were returned. Your father said they didn't need my money. And they didn't, not financially. But those checks were never about the money, Abigail. They were about showing you that I was thinking of you. That I cared." She opened the album again, turning to a page where I'd placed a photograph of me sitting alone at Abigail's 10th birthday party, separated from the family table. I remembered that day vividly, how Thomas's mother had loudly commented that the caterers had done such a wonderful job, looking directly at me, knowing I could barely afford the gift I'd brought. "I remember this party," Abigail said softly. "Grandma Preston told me you'd requested to sit at the other table because you were uncomfortable with our kind of people. The casual cruelty of it made me catch my breath. That's not true. I was told to sit there." She flipped to another page. The returned birthday cards, the unanswered voicemails transcribed by date, the Christmas gift receipts. "I never knew you sent these. I thought." She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "I thought you just didn't care." "Oh, Abigail," I said, finally risking moving to sit beside her on the couch. "I have always cared. From the moment you were born. You're my only grandchild. My family." She looked up at me, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "I'm so sorry about that Instagram post. I was angry. I believed what they told me. That you only came around when you needed something." I reached out cautiously and took her hand. She didn't pull away. "I never needed anything from your family except to be included, Abigail. To be allowed to love you. That's all." She nodded, wiping at her tears with her free hand. I confronted Mom last night after reading through this. She tried to deny it at first, then she said you were exaggerating. But when I showed her the return checks, the unanswered messages, she took a shaky breath. She finally admitted it. She said they thought it was for the best, that they were protecting me from your instability. The old hurt resurfaced. Instability? Because you were always working, always tired. She said you weren't reliable. Abigail shook her head. But that wasn't it, was it? You were reliable enough to put her through college. Reliable enough to show up at every event even when they treated you terribly. The simple justice of her words made my throat tighten. For so long, I'd been cast as the villain in their family story. The neglectful mother who became the inconvenient grandmother. And now, finally, someone had seen through the lies. What happened after I left yesterday? I asked. Abigail's expression hardened. I waited until everyone was gone. Then I started looking through the album. Mom tried to take it away. Dad said you were just trying to cause trouble. But I wouldn't let them have it. I locked myself in my room and read everything. Her voice broke. 22 years of lies. They kept you from me. They made me believe you didn't want me in your life. And now? I asked, hardly daring to hope. She squeezed my hand, her eyes meeting mine with newfound determination. Now we start over, Grandma. If that's what you want too. Grandma. She'd never called me that before. It had always been Janet. On the rare occasion she'd addressed me directly. I would like that very much, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional storm inside. Abigail nodded, then looked down at the album again, running her fingers over the embossed title. The truth behind the pictures. There's going to be consequences, she said quietly. Dad is furious. Mom, I don't know. Defensive. Guilty. Both maybe. I didn't do this to hurt them, Abigail. I just couldn't bear for you to think I was someone who didn't care about you. I know, she said. And I'm glad you did. But things are never going to be the same in our family again. As I looked at her, my granddaughter finally seeing me for who I truly was, I felt a lifetime of pain begin to ease. Sometimes, I said carefully, different is better than the same. The storm arrived 3 days after Abigail's visit. I was watering my small collection of houseplants when a sharp, insistent knocking rattled my apartment door. I knew before opening it who would be standing there. Rebecca and Thomas stood in the hallway, their faces set in matching expressions of controlled fury. Rebecca's arms were crossed tightly over her designer blouse, while Thomas loomed beside her, jaw clenched. May we come in? Rebecca asked, her voice clipped. I stepped aside wordlessly. They marched into my living room, neither taking a seat despite my gesture toward the couch. Thomas surveyed my apartment with barely concealed disdain, while Rebecca stared directly at me, her eyes hard. What exactly were you trying to accomplish with that stunt? She demanded without preamble. I straightened my shoulders. It wasn't a stunt, Rebecca. It was the truth. Your version of the truth, Thomas interjected, his voice cold. A carefully curated collection of old grievances designed to turn Abigail against us. No, I said firmly. It was documentation. Evidence. Things that actually happened, not stories I made up. Rebecca's expression flickered momentarily. You had no right to ambush our family gathering and dump decades of your resentment on our daughter. Just like you had no right to return my checks? To hide my birthday cards? To tell Abigail I chose not to be part of her life. Thomas stepped forward. We were protecting her from your inconsistency. Your emotional manipulation. You were barely there for Rebecca growing up. Why would we expose Abigail to the same disappointment? The familiar accusation stung, but this time I didn't shrink from it. I worked 2 jobs to give Rebecca everything she needed after your father died, I said, looking directly at my daughter. I missed things I wanted desperately to attend because I was making sure we had a roof over our heads and food on the table. That wasn't abandonment, that was sacrifice. Rebecca's composure cracked slightly. You were always exhausted, always distracted. The other mothers had time for school activities, for helping with homework. The other mothers had husbands with incomes. I cut in. They had family support, inheritances, alimony. I had nothing but my own 2 hands. For a moment, something like doubt crossed Rebecca's face, but Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. That's ancient history, he said dismissively. What matters is that you've disrupted our family. Abigail is questioning everything now. She's withdrawn from us. She's talking about taking a semester off from law school which we're paying for, by the way. This isn't about money, Thomas. Isn't it? He fired back. You've always resented our lifestyle. You couldn't provide it, so you're trying to sabotage it. I shook my head, suddenly tired of the old arguments, the same accusations dressed in new words. I never resented your wealth. I resented how you used it to push me out of my granddaughter's life. How you made it clear I wasn't good enough to be included in your perfect family portrait. Rebecca flinched visibly this time. That's not true. You were always invited to the important events. Invited to sit at the farthest table. Invited to arrive late and leave early. Invited as an obligation, not a beloved family member. Thomas made a dismissive sound. You're determined to be the victim here, aren't you? Poor Janet, excluded by the rich in-laws. I'm not a victim, I said quietly. I'm a woman who worked herself to the bone to provide for her family, only to be erased from that family story when she became inconvenient. The room fell silent. Rebecca's eyes darted around, refusing to meet mine, while Thomas's face flushed with anger. What do you want from us? Rebecca finally asked. An apology? Money. The suggestion that this was about financial gain made my stomach turn. I want what I've always wanted, to be treated as Abigail's grandmother. To have a relationship with her that isn't controlled and filtered by you. That's not your decision to make, Thomas snapped. No, came a voice from the doorway. It's mine. We all turned to see Abigail standing there, key in hand. I'd given it to her after her last visit, never expecting she'd arrive in the middle of this confrontation. She stepped into the apartment, her expression resolute. I let myself in. I hope that's okay, Grandma. Grandma. The word hung in the air, a declaration of alliance that made Thomas's face darken further. Abigail, he started, his tone dropping into the authoritative register he probably used in boardrooms. This situation is more complicated than you understand. Actually, she replied, moving to stand beside me, it's very simple. You and Mom systematically cut Grandma out of my life, then lied to me about it for 22 years. Rebecca shook her head. We were trying to protect you. From what? Abigail demanded. From knowing that my grandmother worked 2 jobs to put you through college? From the birthday card she sent that I never received? From knowing that the checks she sent for my education were returned because they didn't fit your narrative? Rebecca paled. Abby, please, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, Abigail cut in, her voice trembling slightly. I read every page of that album. I saw the photographs, the documents, the proof. You didn't just exclude Grandma, you erased her. You made me complicit in hurting her. She turned to face me, tears shining in her eyes. Like that Instagram post. God, I'm so ashamed of that now. Thomas stepped forward, reaching for Abigail's arm. That's enough. We're going home to discuss this as a family. Abigail pulled away from his grasp. I'm not going anywhere with you right now. I'm staying here with Grandma. The look of shock on both their faces might have been comical under different circumstances. This is ridiculous, Thomas sputtered. Janet, tell her this is inappropriate. I met his gaze steadily. My granddaughter is welcome in my home anytime. Rebecca looked between us, something like fear flickering across her face. Abigail, please don't do this. Don't choose sides. I'm not choosing sides, Abigail replied. I'm choosing the truth. And right now I need space from the people who kept it from me for so long. Thomas's face hardened. If you walk away from us now, there will be consequences. Abigail lifted her chin. Like what? You'll cut me off financially? Go ahead. I'd rather work 2 jobs like Grandma did than live with lies. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but whether from hurt or anger I couldn't tell. This conversation isn't over, Thomas said grimly, taking Rebecca's elbow. Come on, Becca. Let's go. As they turned to leave, Rebecca paused in the doorway, looking back at me with a complicated expression, part accusation, part something deeper that I couldn't quite name. You finally got what you wanted, she said softly. I shook my head. This was never what I wanted, Rebecca. I just wanted the truth to be known. The door closed behind them with a quiet click that somehow seemed more final than a slam would have been. Beside me, Abigail exhaled shakily. That was intense. I turned to her, suddenly worried. Are you okay? You didn't have to do that. She gave me a small, determined smile. Actually, I think I did. 6 months can change everything. 6 months of Sunday dinners at my small kitchen table. 6 months of shared laughter and tears. 6 months of building a relationship that should have begun 22 years ago. Abigail had moved into my spare bedroom after the confrontation, despite Thomas's threats to cut off her tuition payments, which he followed through on. She'd withdrawn from law school, a decision that horrified her parents but, as she confided to me late one night, felt like her first authentic choice. I never wanted to be a lawyer, she admitted as we shared tea on my small balcony. That was Dad's dream, not mine. Instead, she'd found a job at a local bookstore and enrolled in evening classes at the community college, studying childhood education, her true passion. The transition wasn't easy. Abigail had never lived on a budget before, never had to check price tags or wait for sales, never experienced the gnawing worry about making rent that had been my constant companion for decades. But she adapted with a grace that made my heart swell with pride. She learned to cook instead of ordering takeout, discovered the satisfaction of finding treasures in thrift stores, and began to appreciate the simple pleasures I'd always known. A good book, a warm cup of tea, a sunset viewed from our modest balcony. Today was special, my 67th birthday. No more silent celebrations, no more solitary cupcakes with unlit candles. Abigail had insisted on planning something, though she'd been mysteriously vague about the details. Just be ready at noon, was all she would say, her eyes twinkling with excitement. So here I was, dressed in a new blouse she'd given me that morning, waiting for whatever surprise she had in store. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to find not just Abigail, but Rebecca standing awkwardly in the hallway. My daughter looked different, thinner, less polished, more human somehow. The carefully maintained facade had cracked, revealing glimpses of the girl I'd raised before wealth and status became her defining characteristics. Happy birthday, Mom, she said softly, holding out a small gift bag. I accepted it wordlessly, too stunned to form a coherent response. Behind her, Abigail gave me an encouraging nod. May I come in? Rebecca asked, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I stepped aside, still processing her unexpected presence. She entered my apartment, her eyes taking in the changes since her last hostile visit. Photographs of Abigail and me on the walls, books stacked on the coffee table, a colorful throw blanket Abigail had found at a local craft fair draped over the couch. It looks nice, she said, surprising me. Cozy. Abigail closed the door behind us. Grandma doesn't know where we're going yet, she told Rebecca with a conspiratorial smile. Rebecca nodded, still standing awkwardly in the middle of my living room. I've made a reservation at Riverside Cafe for lunch. It's where Dad proposed to me. I thought you might like it. The small, casual restaurant by the river had been a favorite of mine decades ago, before life and circumstances had pulled us in different directions. The fact that Rebecca remembered that she'd chosen a place with meaning rather than one of the upscale establishments she usually frequented felt significant. I would like that very much, I said. In the car, Rebecca's car, though not the luxury SUV she'd arrived in during her last visit, the conversation was halting, fragile, like survivors of a natural disaster cautiously assessing the damage, determining what could be salvaged. Thomas and I are taking some time apart, Rebecca said finally as we neared the restaurant. I'm staying in a condo downtown. I glanced at Abigail in the rearview mirror, who gave a small nod, confirming this wasn't news to her. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it despite everything. No mother wants her child's marriage to struggle, regardless of her feelings about the spouse. Rebecca's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Don't be. It's been clarifying. Being away from the mansion, the social obligations, the constant pressure to maintain appearances. I'd forgotten what it's like to just be me. We arrived at the restaurant, a charming riverside establishment that had barely changed in the 30 years since I'd last visited. The hostess led us to a table on the patio overlooking the water, set with a small reserved sign. As we settled in with menus, I noticed Rebecca seemed nervous, fidgeting with her napkin in a way that reminded me of her childhood habits. Abigail, meanwhile, had a look of barely contained excitement, as if she were holding back a secret. "Before we order," Rebecca began, her voice uncertain, "I want to say something." She took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since everything happened. A lot of remembering." She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. Me holding her as a baby, exhaustion and love etched on my young face. "I found this while going through some old boxes," she said. "And it made me realize how much I've forgotten. Or chosen not to remember." I stared at the photograph, memories flooding back. The tiny apartment we'd lived in after Harold died. The nights spent rocking Rebecca to sleep after a late shift at the hospital. The bone-deep weariness that had become as much a part of me as my heartbeat. "I'm not saying I'm ready to forgive everything," Rebecca continued carefully. "Some wounds take time to heal. But I am saying that I've been unfair to you. That I've allowed Thomas and his family to shape a narrative about you that wasn't true. That I've been complicit in keeping you and Abigail apart." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and I saw the glimmer of tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." The words I'd waited decades to hear. Not a complete reconciliation, not a perfect happy ending, but a beginning. An acknowledgement. A crack in the wall that had separated us for so long. "Thank you," I said simply, reaching across the table to touch her hand. Abigail beamed at us both, then reached into her own bag. "I have something to show you too." She pulled out her phone, opened her Instagram account, and turned the screen toward me. There was a new post. A photo of the three of us that a waitress had taken moments ago. Our faces caught in a moment of genuine connection. The caption read, "Celebrating my grandmother's birthday, the strongest woman I know. Thank you for teaching me that truth matters more than appearances, and that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. Hashtag 3 generations, hashtag family truth." Below it, hundreds of likes and comments had already accumulated. A stark contrast to the hurtful post that had started this journey 6 months ago. "I wanted to set the record straight," Abigail said softly. "I wanted everyone to know who you really are." Tears blurred my vision as I looked at the simple public declaration of connection. Not a performance of family harmony for social media, but an honest acknowledgement of our complicated, imperfect, but ultimately loving bond. Rebecca squeezed my hand, and I felt the tentative rebuilding of a bridge I'd thought permanently burned. "Happy birthday, Mom," she said. "Let's order champagne." As the waiter brought our glasses, I looked at the faces of my daughter and granddaughter. One relationship slowly healing, one newly flourishing, and felt a peace I hadn't known in decades. "To truth," I said, raising my glass. "To family," Abigail added. Rebecca met my eyes, something like her old self shining through the carefully constructed facade she'd worn for so long. "To second chances," she said. Our glasses clinked together, catching the sunlight like promises made visible. Not the perfect family I'd once dreamed of, but something real, honest, and ultimately more valuable. The album had done its work. The truth had been revealed. And in that truth we'd found not just reconciliation, but redemption.